let's have a dialogue about dialogue. I love talking dialogue because it is so trend-focused. Every couple of years, in every genre, in every medium, there is a new best way of writing dialogue that has always been the best way of writing dialogue ever since 2 months ago. A good example of that would be West Wing's walk and talk repartee. They didn't invent this, obviously, but they did codify it, which is why I'm specifically talking about West Wing. And it became the right way to write dialogue for TV shows for quite a while, and I think a lot of people still think it is. It's just one way of writing dialogue. It's not the best way, it's not the worst way, it's just a way. But it's so easy to get sucked into these formulas. It's so easy to think, oh, well, obviously that is the right way because these people used it and it turned out fine. But it's just a trend. Let's talk a little bit about the overarching umbrella over these trends. What is dialogue here to do, and how do we write good dialogue? These trends might be useful to us. This snappy repartee might be valuable as a tool, but we have to understand why we're using it and how we're using it. So let's talk about what dialogue actually needs to accomplish. Why are we writing dialogue? In my opinion, the only reason to write dialogue is to control the flow of your story. If the dialogue is driving your story in the wrong direction, it's bad dialogue. You need to remove it or replace it with different dialogue. Dialogue is not the only means to control the flow of the story. Every part of the story controls the flow of the story. So if you're having a hard time getting things to flow well with dialogue, you might try something else like costuming or color balance or stage direction or music or exactly how you're framing the shots. There are literally a million different ways to control the flow of your story. There's no reason to rely on dialogue, and these are not individual methods either. You can combine them. You can have dialogue that also uses costuming or also uses shot framing, because that is obvious. You want to use as many of these tools as possible to control the flow of the story in the right way at the right time. Again, West Wing is a great example of this. The walk and talk system isn't just dialogue. It contains a lot of walking and talking. So it's got all that walking going on. That's not dialogue, that's walking. So obviously they're using more than just dialogue. This is a package deal. You're using dialogue plus the idea that you're moving and the camera gesture to move along with them and the set dressing that's going on behind them and the people that constantly interrupt them. Even if they're not talking, just handing something over, yeah, that's part of the dialogue. That's part of the flow of the story. So this is a way to control the flow of the story. It's extremely effective, which is why it's so popular. I don't like it, though. I actually really despise shows that use this because that particular flow is kind of whitewater rapids. It's a little bit too much for me, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that it's a tool I don't particularly appreciate. Let me give you another example. Monologues, which are technically not dialogues. Shh, nobody tell anybody. Monologues are also a very powerful tool, but they have a very bad reputation. Now, the reason that people generally try to avoid monologues is because first-time writers, new writers, will typically try to just jot down everything that needs to go in the story in one giant lump of exposition. So you get page after page after page of them telling you all about the world or the plot or their past trauma or whatever it is, because the writer wants to put that stuff in the story, and therefore they're just going to cram it in. But this is the wrong way to use monologues. It's not that the tool of monologues is bad, it's that they're using it wrong. Think of monologues like a big saw that you might find in a bandsaw or circular saw or something. It's great if you need to cut a lot of heavy wood, right? It's good if you need to actually do a lot of work. But if your kid sees it and goes over to it and tries to use it, they'll probably saw their fingers off. Monologuing is a much more dangerous tool than something like snappy repartee, just because it kind of gets set off and then goes, and where it lands, you hope it lands in the right place, right? So you got to know what you're doing with monologue in order to use it well. But it does a lot of heavy lifting. Monologuing can completely change the flow of your story in like 30 seconds. It's an incredible tool. It's an industrial tool. I think the easiest example of that is The Incredibles, which I hope you've seen. You might be thinking, oh, you mean when Syndrome is like, oh, you got me monologuing, ah, ha, 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 ha. No, I don't mean that. Those scenes are fun. They definitely do a lot of work because they really establish Syndrome's focus on himself, and all of the heroes attempt to work against him while he's monologuing, using his own weaknesses against him and stuff like that. They're very good scenes, and they do control the flow of the story very well. But they don't haul the story around quite as aggressively as one scene in particular. And of course, that scene is Edna Mode's monologue, where she shows off her supersuits. And she's like, and this one can withstand temperatures of up to 3,000 degrees. Flinters. Now, obviously, this is a fun scene. And I think everybody would agree that it is one of the highlights of the movie, at least in terms of dialogue. But all of that monologue is, technically speaking, worthless, right? You don't need to know any of this stuff. You don't need to know that Violet's supersuit can turn invisible with her, because you'd kind of just assume that if it's a supersuit custom made for Violet, it can do the things that Violet needs it to do. Edna Mode explaining these things is not about Edna Mode explaining these things. It's about hauling the entire story around in a new direction, because the focus of this scene is on Mrs. Incredible. Over here, going, what are you doing? Why are you dragging my kids into this? What's going on? And in less than a minute, it brings the story from basically stopped to moving at 100 miles an hour, because she's on board at the end, and things are changing fast, and things are moving, and it's entirely because Edna Mode has this monologue about these supersuits. Obviously, there is a lot of cleanup to be done, so there is a dialogue after that where she's like, I'm sure I don't know, dear, and all that jazz. But that aside, the monologue portion does the heavy lifting. That's when it's revealed to both us and, of course, Mrs. Incredible, that everything is moving. Everything is really moving. This is not something that's going to stop. It's getting faster and faster and faster, and we have to be there for it. Whether we're on board or against it, we can't ignore it. The monologue drags the entire flow of the story from stopped to moving at 100 miles an hour in less than a minute. It's very fast, very efficient, and very fun. In my opinion, there are no bad tools. There are tools that are often less applicable or more applicable, but there really aren't any bad ones. What I do want to stress, though, is that dialogue never happens in a vacuum. Or even if you wrote it as having, here's a inky black void with nothing in it, and here's some dialogue boxes. Even if you wrote it to happen in a vacuum like this, the fact that it's happening in a vacuum is set dressing, is something important. So dialogue can't happen in a vacuum, even if it's happening in a vacuum. Now, some things like screenplays, these seem to have dialogue that happens in a vacuum, right? If you've ever read a screenplay, it's largely A, this, B, this, A, this, B, this, A, this. And you might think that that's just dialogue in a vacuum. But that's because screenplays are about 1 million miles away from the actual audience. It's understood that there are several layers of professionals who will take this dialogue and dress it up with all of the other methods of controlling story flow. They're the experts in every other kind of story flow, and they understand that these are the bones they're being given to flesh out. So before this reaches the audience, here comes the set dresser, here comes the actor, here comes the scene composer, here comes the photographer, the camera director, here comes the director himself. All of these people add in all of the flesh on these bones. So even though this is technically dialogue in a vacuum, nobody ever sees it in a vacuum. It gets dressed up for the final audience. So when you're writing dialogue, keep in mind that there are 1 million other things that are going on in your story. All of the things the audience can see or hear, all of the descriptions being narrated at them, if it's a radio play or whatever, All of these things also contribute to the flow of the story, and they should work with the dialogue. That's why you often get advice like, well, have a prop. Like if the character is doing dialogue, have them also be, spinning a fidget spinner or whatever. All of that is to introduce more flow elements, more control elements, so that you can control the flow of the story better. Those are not usually codified as dialogue writing techniques because that's technically not dialogue, but dialogue is just one part of the picture, and using everything together is a skill that you need to learn if you're writing. So that's my opinion. Dialogue needs to control the flow of the story. If you use it wrong, you will end up driving your story into a wall or into a giant pile of mud. And that can happen with any tool. The snappy back and forth banter, I've seen that stop so many stories in their tracks and just go nowhere because it didn't go in the correct direction. They used the tool wrong. So always keep the flow of your story in mind and understand that the dialogue you're writing helps that flow. If it doesn't, it's bad dialogue.